There's a particular kind of respect that only comes from someone who has genuinely been there. Not there in the sense of sitting in a comfortable chair and watching events unfold on a monitor, but truly there in the middle of the storm with the lights blazing and the whole country watching and absolutely no room for error. Tom Brokaw has been that kind of there more times than most people can count. And after more than half a century of watching the news business evolve, collapse, reinvent itself, and evolve again, the 86-year-old broadcasting legend has finally decided to say out loud what many inside the industry have been quietly thinking for years. Savannah Guthrie is the real thing. This is not the kind of statement that gets made lightly. Brokaw is not a man who scatters compliments like confetti at a parade. He is precise, measured, and deeply selective about where he places his professional respect. So when word spread that he had been praising Guthrie's sharp legal instincts, her remarkable resilience, and her ability to hold the center of American morning television together during some of its most turbulent years, people paid attention. Not because it was surprising that someone admired Savannah Guthrie, but because of who was doing the admiring. To understand what it means for Tom Brokaw to endorse anyone, you first have to understand the world that made him. Brokaw was formed by an America that no longer exists, and he understood that world better than almost anyone alive. He grew up in the flatlands of South Dakota, far from the corridors of media power, in a time when the evening news was treated with the same reverence as a church service. Families gathered around their television sets, not for entertainment, but for information, and the man delivering that information carried an enormous weight of public trust on his shoulders. That trust was not given freely. It was earned through years of painstaking, often unglamorous work in small markets before anyone with real power noticed you existed. Brokaw paid those dues with interest. He clawed his way through the ranks of local broadcasting, learning the trade in a way that could only be learned by actually doing it, by making mistakes in front of smaller audiences before the stakes became national. By the time he reached the top of the NBC mountain, he had developed an almost preternatural ability to remain calm in the middle of catastrophe. Watergate, Vietnam, the fall of the Berlin Wall. Brokaw was present for moments that genuinely changed the shape of human history, and he reported on all of them without flinching, without crumbling, and without losing the thread of the story. He was part of a triumvirate, alongside Peter Jennings and Dan Rather, that essentially defined what it meant to be an American news anchor during the second half of the 20th century. These were not simply television personalities. They were the gatekeepers of national reality. They decided, in very real ways, what the country knew and how the country understood it. If Tom Brokaw led with a story, that story mattered. If he dismissed something with a raised eyebrow, the audience took note of that too. The power was enormous, and for decades, it felt permanent. Of course, nothing in journalism is permanent. The 24-hour news cycle arrived and began quietly dismantling the architecture that men like Brokaw had spent their careers constructing. The internet accelerated that demolition dramatically. By the time Brokaw stepped away from the nightly news desk in 2004, the landscape was already shifting beneath the feet of everyone in the business. He left at the right moment, with his reputation pristine and his legacy secured. But stepping away didn't mean he stopped watching. If anything, the distance gave him a clearer view of what was happening to an industry he loved deeply. Savannah Guthrie did not arrive in television the way Tom Brokaw did. She did not work her way up through police scanners and local pancake breakfasts and small market affiliate stations. She arrived from a completely different direction, through law school, through litigation, through years of learning how to construct an argument so airtight that the opposing side had nowhere left to go. When she eventually made her way into broadcast journalism, she brought all of that courtroom discipline with her, and it showed immediately. What made Guthrie genuinely unusual from the beginning was not simply her legal background, though that was formidable. It was the combination of that razor-sharp analytical mind with a warmth and accessibility that felt completely unforced. She could break down a complex constitutional question in language that was clear and precise without being condescending. and then pivot within the same breath to a conversation that felt like it was happening between two old friends. That combination is rarer than it sounds, and the television audience recognized it even when the industry gatekeepers were still making up their minds about her. Her path to the top of the Today Show was not a smooth, straight highway. It was full of unexpected obstacles, difficult moments, and at least one genuine institutional earthquake that would have broken a less resilient person entirely. When Matt Lauer's career collapsed in late 2017, the fallout wasn't just personal or professional for those directly involved. It shook the entire foundation of a show that had been one of the most powerful brands in American morning television for decades. The Today Show had survived ratings battles, format changes, and personnel shuffles over the years, but nothing quite like this. The institution was wobbling, and everyone knew it. Savannah Guthrie did not wobble. What she did instead was something far more difficult and far more meaningful. She sat in front of a live audience of millions and allowed herself to be genuinely human. She didn't reach for the polished, carefully rehearsed language of crisis management. She said, simply and honestly, that she was devastated and confused and trying to process the situation in real time alongside the people watching her. It was a moment of such disarming authenticity that it immediately recalibrated the audience's relationship with her and with the show itself. In choosing vulnerability over performance, she demonstrated a kind of leadership that the old guard of broadcasting would have considered almost unthinkable. Tom Brokaw noticed. How could he not? What makes the connection between Brokaw and Guthrie interesting is not the obvious contrast between their eras or their styles, though that contrast is certainly striking. What makes it interesting is the underlying similarity in what it actually cost each of them to do what they did. Brokaw's tenure at the top of American broadcasting looks, from the outside, like an almost unbroken string of triumphs. And in many ways it was. But the personal toll of that career was real and rarely discussed openly. The missed family moments, the years spent in hotel rooms in countries most people have never visited, chasing stories that required everything he had to give. The constant pressure of being the voice that 100 million people turned to during moments of national crisis, knowing that a single misstep could shatter the trust it had taken decades to build. He was bulletproof on camera because he had to be. What that performance cost him privately is a different conversation entirely. In 2013, that private reality became very public when Brokaw was diagnosed with multiple myeloma. The disease didn't care about his legacy or his Emmy Awards or the fact that he had once stood at the Berlin Wall and narrated the end of the Cold War for a global audience. It arrived without asking permission and forced one of the most composed men in American public life to confront his own fragility in the most direct way imaginable. His response, characteristically, was to face it head on. He wrote about it. He talked about it. He refused to let the experience become something hidden and shameful, even though concealment would have been far easier. Savannah Guthrie has faced her own version of that reckoning, in her own way and on her own terms. Her journey to motherhood was long and painful and nothing like the effortless narrative that celebrity culture typically offers. IVF, uncertainty, the particular exhaustion of wanting something desperately and not knowing whether it will ever arrive. When she finally had her children, she spoke about the experience with a frankness that was both brave and generous, because she understood that millions of women watching her were living versions of the same story and feeling far too alone in it. Then came the accident that nearly ended her career without warning. A moment of ordinary domestic chaos involving her young son and a toy train resulted in serious eye damage that required multiple surgeries and weeks of imposed darkness. For a woman whose entire professional life depended on her ability to look, to observe, to notice the small telling detail that a less trained eye might miss, the possibility of losing her vision was not merely frightening. It was existential. She came back to the desk, wearing glasses and looking exactly as vulnerable as she felt, and she told the story honestly, because honesty had always been her most powerful tool. This is the deeper reason Brokaw's praise carries so much weight. He is not simply complimenting her technique or acknowledging her ratings. He is recognizing a fellow traveler on a road that looks glamorous from the outside and is actually extraordinarily hard. He has been through the fire in his own way, and he can see clearly that she has been through hers. There is a temptation to frame Brokaw's endorsement of Guthrie as a simple, sentimental, generational handoff. The old master blessing the worthy successor. A clean, satisfying narrative with a bow on top. But the reality is considerably more complicated and considerably more interesting than that. Because what Brokaw is actually acknowledging, when you listen carefully to what he has been saying, is that the world Savannah Guthrie operates in is harder than the world he operated in. Not harder in the physical sense, not harder in the way that flying into a war zone is hard, but harder in a different and arguably more relentless way. The modern media landscape does not offer any shelter. There is no closing time, no moment when the cameras switch off and the pressure lifts and you're allowed to simply be a private person for a few hours. Everything is observed, everything is archived, and everything is immediately available to an audience that has been trained to expect total access and instant accountability. Savannah Guthrie has built a career in that environment without losing either her professional credibility or her fundamental humanity, and that is genuinely remarkable. She is not trying to be Tom Brokaw in a different decade. She is doing something that has never quite been done before, which is holding together the serious and the human, the analytical and the emotional, the authoritative and the accessible, in a single coherent public identity. The fact that she makes it look relatively effortless is the biggest illusion of all. Brokaw understands this. His decision to speak up at this stage of his life is not nostalgia, and it is not charity. It is the considered judgment of someone who has spent over 60 years studying this business from the inside, watching who lasts and who doesn't, watching who bends and who breaks. The people who last, he has learned, are the ones who remain fundamentally themselves no matter how much pressure is applied. Savannah Guthrie has remained herself. She has carried the mourning, held the institution together, raised her children, survived her surgeries, navigated the outrage cycles and the ratings wars and the endless scrutiny, and she has done all of it without becoming someone she is not. That, in the end, is what Tom Brokaw is really saying. Not that the torch has been passed, but that the flame is in good hands and always was.